In an unimaginable moment of cruelty, a Karen from our HOA crossed every line imaginable, dragging my disabled daughter behind her golf cart, yelling at her to run. What followed was a confrontation that would change everything. In the quiet, suburban neighborhood where we lived, days typically passed in a routine manner. The streets were lined with well-maintained homes, each with their neatly trimmed lawns and flower beds. The area was peaceful, and the sounds of children playing and neighbors chatting were a familiar comfort. My daughter and I had always enjoyed this serene atmosphere, finding moments of peace in the simple things. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew each other, where the most dramatic occurrences were the occasional lawn dispute or the seasonal change of decorations. On that particular afternoon, we were spending time in the front yard, just enjoying the warmth of the sun. The air was crisp, with a light breeze rustling the leaves of the trees that lined the sidewalks. My daughter, though she had physical challenges that made mobility difficult, was always full of life. Her infectious laugh and playful spirit were a constant reminder of her resilience. She loved spending time outdoors, where she could feel the grass beneath her feet and the fresh air on her face. We had no expectations for the day. We weren't planning anything significant, just savoring the quiet simplicity of life. My daughter was playing with her favorite toy, a small remote-controlled car that she maneuvered carefully across the pavement. I was tending to some of the plants in our garden, the soothing task of watering flowers being the perfect way to unwind. There were no sounds of tension or discomfort in the air, just the routine of a peaceful afternoon in a safe and familiar environment. But that calm atmosphere was about to be shattered. Without any warning, the peace was broken by the sound of a vehicle approaching. I turned to see a woman from the HOA driving her golf cart down the street, a typical sight for the neighborhood. She was a frequent figure in the community, known for her involvement in various neighborhood activities and her self-appointed role in maintaining the standards of the homeowners association. Most people, including myself, had learned to tolerate her occasional visits, knowing she was always keeping an eye on the neighborhood. While her presence was often seen as an irritation by some, it wasn't something that made us overly concerned until that moment. She slowed her cart as she approached our yard, and I could feel a shift in the air. It was as if her presence was purposefully drawing attention to us, and her abrupt stop in front of our house made it clear that something was coming. I noticed the way she peered down at my daughter, a look of judgment in her eyes that instantly sent a wave of unease through me. I wasn't sure what had prompted this encounter, but I had learned long ago that the HOA's tendency to scrutinize every small detail could turn even the most innocuous actions into problems. At first, there was no real indication of what was about to transpire. The woman began speaking to me in her usual condescending manner, asking questions about things like the condition of our lawn and whether we had completed certain routine tasks that were required by the HOA's rules. It wasn't unusual for her to approach us like this. She would often stop to inspect things, sometimes offering unsolicited advice or commentary about how we could improve our property. But this time, there was something different. Her tone was sharper, more forceful, and there was an underlying tension in her words. As she spoke to me, I noticed my daughter, who had been busy with her toy, becoming increasingly uncomfortable. I had seen this before, how the woman's presence made my daughter uneasy. It wasn't just the woman's attitude, but the way she carried herself, like her authority was something to be feared. As my daughter looked up at me, I could tell she didn't understand why the woman was there or why her focus seemed to be entirely on us. She was confused, but she tried to remain calm, just as she always did when faced with discomfort. I continued to listen to the woman's complaints, thinking that perhaps she was just going to make a simple remark and leave. But as I glanced at her, I could feel a change in the air, a shift from the calm exchange of words to something far more sinister. My daughter's confusion deepened, and before I knew it, the woman had made an unexpected move. She abruptly got out of her golf cart and started walking toward my daughter. The interaction I had imagined, the usual comments about lawn care or neighborhood upkeep, had taken a sudden, disturbing turn. What followed would become a memory I wish I could forget, but one that would forever change how I viewed this neighborhood, this woman, and the seemingly idyllic life we had always taken for granted. The calm had dissolved entirely, and in its place stood a terrifying confrontation that no one, least of all my daughter, could have predicted. What was once a peaceful afternoon had now transformed into something unrecognizable, and I had no idea where this was heading. The only thing I knew for sure was that my daughter and I were in for an experience that neither of us would ever forget. What happened next unfolded with such rapidity that it was hard to grasp the full extent of it in the moment. The woman's behavior had already been unnerving, but when she made her move, it became clear that her sense of entitlement and control was far beyond what I could have ever imagined. Before I had the chance to fully react, she approached my daughter with alarming speed and aggression. The woman reached out and physically grabbed my daughter's arm, yanking her with surprising force. In an instant, she was pulling my child toward her golf cart, disregarding the fact that my daughter had difficulties moving quickly due to her physical challenges. My daughter, who had always been so brave in the face of her struggles, was visibly startled. The look on her face was one of confusion, fear, and a deep sense of powerlessness. She tried to resist, to pull away from the woman's grasp, but her body simply couldn't keep up. The woman, however, showed no regard for my daughter's limitations. There was no consideration for her disability or the fact that she wasn't physically able to respond in the way the woman was demanding. Instead, the woman's voice grew sharper, more insistent, and she began ordering my daughter to run faster. To keep up with the golf cart as it began to move slowly forward, it was a demand that defied all reason. My daughter had always been a fighter, but no matter how hard she tried, her body couldn't meet the cruel expectation being placed upon her. Her movements were slow, labored, and forced. The contrast between the woman's harsh insistence and my daughter's desperate struggle was jarring. It was as though the woman believed my daughter's disability was something to be ignored, something that could be easily overcome with sheer willpower. The cruelty of it all struck me like a blow to the chest. The woman's words were relentless, as if she felt entitled to command my daughter as though she were an object, not a human being with her own limits, her own rights, and her own dignity. She continued to shout at my daughter to move faster, to run faster, with no regard for the physical toll it was taking. Each time my daughter stumbled or faltered, the woman's voice grew louder and more demanding, as though her frustration with my daughter's limitations was somehow justified. The unrelenting nature of her commands was both terrifying and appalling. In that moment, it was impossible to comprehend the depth of the cruelty she was capable of. The act itself was so far beyond anything I could have imagined that it was, as though time stood still. The woman wasn't just pulling my daughter behind her golf cart, she was dehumanizing her. She was reducing my daughter, who had always struggled so hard to overcome her challenges, to nothing more than an object to be controlled, a person whose limitations were seen as inconvenient rather than as a reality to be respected. I stood frozen, paralyzed by the sheer audacity of her actions. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening and how it had escalated so quickly. There was no warning, no sign that she was capable of such behavior. All I had expected was a routine HOA inspection, perhaps some mundane comments or reminders. But this? This was something far darker, far more malicious. It was an act of cruelty, an abuse of power, and a violation of my daughter's basic human rights. In that moment, I realized that this woman wasn't just an overzealous neighbor. She wasn't simply a member of the HOA trying to enforce her own set of rules. She was a person who believed that she could control others without consequence, who felt that her position in the community gave her the right to treat people however she saw fit. The woman wasn't just making a demand, she was enforcing her own warped sense of authority, one that came at the expense of my daughter's well-being. The overwhelming sense of helplessness I felt in that moment was crushing. My daughter, who had always fought so hard to live her life with dignity, was now being forced to suffer at the hands of someone who should have known better, someone who had no business treating her in such a degrading and dehumanizing way. The reality of what was unfolding before me felt surreal. How could anyone, let alone an adult, behave in such an inhumane manner? How could someone look at a disabled child and see nothing but an inconvenience to be dealt with, to be hurried along like a burden? The more I observed this disturbing act, the more I realized the true scope of the woman's cruelty. It wasn't just the physical act of dragging my daughter behind the golf cart. It wasn't just her demanding that my daughter run faster, despite her physical limitations. It was the emotional and psychological harm that was being inflicted as well. My daughter was not only being forced to physically exert herself beyond her capacity, but she was also being subjected to a form of humiliation and degradation. The emotional weight of that experience was far heavier than the physical one. It was a betrayal of everything I had always believed about the community we lived in, the notion that we were all part of a collective, caring environment. To witness my daughter, who had always been treated with kindness by most, endure such cruelty at the hands of someone who should have been an ally was a blow to my very core. The trust I had in the people around us had been shattered, and in its place, there was only a deep sense of outrage and disbelief. As the events unfolded, I knew that this was no longer just an isolated incident. This was a moment that would change everything, a moment that would ignite a fire within me to seek justice for my daughter and make sure that this kind of behavior was never allowed to happen again. What had started as a quiet afternoon had now become the catalyst for a fight I wasn't prepared for, but one I would face with everything I had. The verbal assault that followed was as harrowing as the physical act. As the woman continued to pull my daughter behind her, the words she spewed were harsh, cutting, and completely devoid of empathy. She didn't stop to consider the sheer cruelty of her actions. Instead, she focused entirely on her sense of authority and control. Every word was another layer of degradation, a clear message that she saw my daughter not as a person, but as an obstacle to be moved or removed. The first insult came in the form of a sharp command, demanding that my daughter pick up the pace and stop being so slow. The words were cold, delivered without any concern for my daughter's struggle. This wasn't a gentle encouragement or even a typical reprimand. It was a demand, one that lacked understanding, and instead was driven by impatience and an unreasonable expectation. What was even more shocking was the way she spoke to my daughter, as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience to be dealt with. The woman didn't recognize my daughter's limits. She didn't see her disability. All she saw was someone who wasn't meeting her arbitrary standards. The next words were even more damning. "If you can't keep up, I'll just leave you behind." The threat was chilling. It wasn't just a statement of frustration or a harsh way of expressing impatience. It was an explicit threat to abandon my daughter in a vulnerable state, left to face the consequences of her physical limitations. That threat alone was enough to send a ripple of fear through me. But it was the callousness behind it that truly stunned me. There was no remorse in her tone, no recognition that she was dealing with a child, much less one with physical challenges. Her voice continued to grow louder, filled with a mixture of frustration and indignation, as though my daughter's struggle was an affront to her own sense of entitlement. "You need to move faster! This isn't a playground! Keep up or I'll make sure your parents hear about this!" The words were meant to be degrading, to make my daughter feel small and incapable. The very idea that she could punish a child, especially one with physical disabilities, because they couldn't move at the same speed as others was incomprehensible. It was a violation of basic human dignity. My daughter, who was already trying to keep up despite her limitations, now faced not only the physical strain of being dragged along, but the added burden of these cruel words. As her insults continued, I could feel the anger rising within me, a sense of righteous fury at the injustice of it all. But at the same time, I was frozen by disbelief. How could anyone say such things to a child? How could anyone treat another human being this way? The woman was so consumed by her own belief in her authority that she failed to see the harm she was causing. She didn't understand that she wasn't just berating a disabled child. She was breaking down her spirit, crushing her confidence, and undermining her sense of self-worth. The more she shouted, the more my daughter seemed to shrink, her body physically wilting under the pressure of this relentless assault. It wasn't just the physical strain of being dragged behind the golf cart. It was the emotional toll that was now weighing down on her. I could see her face, flushed with exertion and embarrassment, as the woman's words cut deep into her psyche. She wasn't just being humiliated in front of me. She was being humiliated in front of someone who held power over her in a way that shouldn't have existed in the first place. Her words escalated further as the woman's frustration grew. "You're just lazy. Everyone else can keep up, why can't you?" This was a statement that stung the most because it completely disregarded everything my daughter had worked for. It ignored the countless challenges she had faced just to be able to move in the world. It dismissed all the therapy sessions, the physical and emotional struggles, and the resilience she had shown throughout her life. The woman's words weren't just an insult to my daughter, they were an insult to everything she had endured and overcome. The language used by the woman was designed to dehumanize. It wasn't just about moving at a certain speed. It was about stripping away my daughter's humanity, reducing her to a figure that existed only to meet the woman's expectations. My daughter wasn't allowed to be herself, to move at her own pace, to exist in the world on her terms. Instead, she was being forced into someone else's narrow view of what was acceptable, what was normal, and what was right. The woman's words were the ultimate betrayal. They revealed the depth of her cruelty and the extent to which she was willing to go to assert her perceived authority. What was most painful, though, was the fact that she was targeting my daughter, someone who could never defend herself in the way an able-bodied child might. She was vulnerable in a way the woman could not, and would not, understand. And that was the greatest tragedy of all. In that moment, I understood something profound. The woman wasn't just violating my daughter's personal space, her right to move freely. She was attacking her dignity, her sense of self, and her place in the world. She was erasing the humanity of a child who had fought so hard to be seen and heard. It wasn't just an attack on my daughter. It was an attack on all of us, on everything we had worked to build, and on every value we had tried to teach her about respect, kindness, and human dignity. The harshness of her words left a scar, not just on my daughter, but on the entire sense of community and safety we had once believed was here. When the situation reached its breaking point, I knew I had to act. The moment I saw my daughter's face flushed with exhaustion and humiliation, something inside me snapped. It wasn't just about the physical act of dragging her behind the golf cart anymore. It was about the emotional and psychological damage that was being inflicted upon her. I had seen my daughter face challenges her entire life, but never had I seen her so defeated, so small. And I wasn't about to let that happen. Not without a fight. I took a deep breath and marched toward the woman, trying to control the fury that was building within me. The sense of helplessness that had gripped me earlier was gone, replaced by a sharp, righteous anger. I wasn't going to allow this woman to get away with what she had done, not to my daughter, not to anyone. The time for silence had passed. I needed to confront her, to demand an explanation for her actions, and to make it clear that her behavior was unacceptable. I approached her, standing tall, trying to project strength even as my heart raced with anger. "What do you think you're doing?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of fury and disbelief. The woman, who had been so eager to exert her authority over my daughter, seemed momentarily taken aback. Her eyes flickered toward me, but there was no remorse, no sense of guilt in her gaze. Instead, she gave me a condescending look, as though she couldn't understand why I was so upset. "I'm making sure she follows the rules," she said flatly, her tone dismissive. "She's not meeting expectations, and it's my job to make sure everyone is compliant." At that moment, her complete lack of empathy became apparent. She wasn't even attempting to acknowledge the situation for what it truly was: abuse. She wasn't concerned with my daughter's well-being, her dignity, or her rights. All she cared about was her own self-imposed authority. She seemed to believe that she had the right to dictate how people should behave, to force them into compliance with whatever rules she decided were important. But what struck me most was her indifference. There was no recognition of the harm she had caused, no admission that what she had done was cruel and unjust. She seemed completely uninterested in my daughter's struggles, or in the fact that she had treated a disabled child with such disregard. To her, my daughter was just another person to be managed, another task to be completed. The humanity of the situation, my daughter's pain, her vulnerability, was invisible to her. I refused to let her dismiss what had happened so easily. "You can't treat people like that," I said, my voice firmer now, even as my heart continued to race. "She's a child, and she has a disability. You don't get to treat her as if she's just a problem to be solved. You need to apologize to her right now." The woman's face hardened. "I'm not going to apologize for making sure rules are followed," she snapped, her voice cold and unwavering. "If you're going to make a scene about it, that's your problem. I was just doing my job." The justification was maddening. She had reduced a situation of profound emotional distress to nothing more than an issue of rules and regulations. She had completely dehumanized my daughter, turning her into a mere obstacle to be dealt with. The rules she referred to, the standards she upheld, none of it mattered in that moment. What mattered was that my daughter had been humiliated and forced to endure physical and emotional pain. What mattered was that she had been treated as less than human, as if she didn't deserve the basic respect and dignity that every person is entitled to. It was clear that the woman wasn't going to back down, no matter how much I protested. She had built herself up in her mind as someone who was in charge, someone who held the power to control others and enforce her will. And she was too entrenched in that belief to see the situation for what it was: a violation, an abuse of power, and a clear act of bullying. But despite her cold indifference, I didn't back down. I stood my ground, demanding that she take responsibility for her actions. "You don't get to bully my daughter and then brush it off as if it's nothing," I said, my words now more forceful. "What you did was wrong. You owe her an apology, and I'm not leaving until you give one." The woman's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty. She had expected to intimidate me, to have the upper hand, but I wasn't afraid of her, and I wasn't going to let her get away with what she had done. I wasn't going to let her make my daughter feel invisible, powerless, or unimportant. I wasn't going to allow this woman to trample over our rights, just because she felt she could. The confrontation dragged on. Each word I spoke met with the woman's unwavering defenses and justifications. Her refusal to acknowledge the harm she had caused only fueled my determination. I wasn't just fighting for my daughter. I was fighting for every person who had ever been pushed aside, belittled, or mistreated by someone in a position of power. I wasn't going to let this woman's cruelty stand without consequence. As the confrontation continued, it became clear that I wasn't going to get an apology from her. She was too entrenched in her own sense of righteousness to admit wrongdoing. But the one thing I knew for sure was that this encounter was not going to end quietly. I had made it known that I wouldn't stand idly by, that I would hold her accountable for her actions. And that, in itself, was a victory. I turned to my daughter, who had been standing quietly during the entire exchange, and gave her a reassuring smile. She may have been subjected to cruelty that day, but she was not alone. She was seen, she was heard, and she was protected. And as long as I had breath in my body, I would continue to fight for her and for everyone who deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. The fight for justice had only just begun. The aftermath of the incident was not something that could be easily brushed aside or forgotten. It was a turning point, not only for me and my daughter, but for our entire family. The events that transpired had left a lasting imprint on all of us, shaping our perceptions of the world around us and our role in it. We had always prided ourselves on living in a community that valued kindness, understanding, and respect. But what had occurred shattered that illusion, revealing a darker side of human nature, one that, when unchecked, could lead to cruelty and injustice. The emotional toll of what happened wasn't something that could be quantified easily. My daughter, who had always been a resilient and determined young person, now faced a new kind of challenge. The trauma of the event was more than just physical. It went deep into her psyche. What had once been a place of comfort and familiarity, our own neighborhood had now become a source of anxiety and fear. The woman's cruel behavior had not only caused my daughter emotional distress, but had also made her question her place in the community. For a child who had spent so much of her life overcoming physical limitations, this incident was a harsh reminder that some people didn't see her as an individual worthy of respect, but as someone who could be easily dismissed and dehumanized. For me, the reality of what had happened was equally difficult to process. As a parent, seeing your child subjected to such cruelty is an experience that no one should have to endure. The overwhelming sense of helplessness I had felt in those moments of confrontation was still fresh in my mind. I had been forced to watch as my daughter, a vulnerable child, was treated with a total lack of empathy, her worth reduced to a mere inconvenience in someone else's eyes. The anger that had surged within me during that confrontation was still burning, but it had now transformed into something else. A determination to ensure that what had happened would not be allowed to go unnoticed or unaddressed. The pain from that experience didn't fade quickly. In fact, it lingered long after the confrontation had ended. My daughter struggled with feelings of inadequacy and shame, emotions that were completely foreign to her before this incident. She had always been proud of her ability to face challenges head-on, but now she was grappling with a profound sense of being wronged. I watched as she withdrew more into herself. The vibrant, carefree spirit that once defined her now shadowed by self-doubt and fear. As a parent, I felt a deep sorrow for the emotional scars this woman had inflicted upon her. But I also knew that I couldn't let these scars define my daughter. I had to help her heal, to remind her that she was not the sum of someone else's cruel actions, that she was strong, capable, and deserving of respect. In the weeks that followed, I found myself reflecting more on what had transpired and what it meant for our future. I realized that standing up for what was right often meant confronting the darkness directly. It wasn't enough to simply feel outraged or upset by what had happened. I had to take action, not just for my daughter, but for the countless other individuals who might find themselves in a similar position. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a manifestation of a much larger issue, one that involved power dynamics, the abuse of authority, and the systemic disregard for the rights of those who are perceived as vulnerable or weaker. Our fight for justice was just beginning. While I had confronted the woman directly, demanding an apology and holding her accountable for her actions, that alone wasn't enough. I knew that if nothing was done to address this behavior, it would continue, perhaps not with my daughter, but with someone else's. The thought of others enduring the same treatment in silence was unacceptable to me. I had to ensure that this kind of cruelty would not be tolerated in our community. I began reaching out to the relevant authorities, the neighborhood associations, and even legal advisors, seeking guidance on how to properly address what had happened. I wanted to ensure that the woman's behavior was not swept under the rug, that there would be consequences for her actions. It was a difficult process. Many people I spoke with were either unwilling to get involved or too afraid to speak out. Some expressed sympathy but didn't want to take action, unwilling to challenge the status quo. It became clear that there was a systemic issue at play, one where those in positions of power were allowed to act with impunity, often at the expense of the most vulnerable in the community. But I couldn't let that deter me. I couldn't allow the fear of rocking the boat to prevent me from doing what was right. I knew that standing up for my daughter and for justice wasn't going to be easy. There would be resistance, there would be setbacks, and there would be moments when it felt like progress was impossible. But I also knew that my fight wasn't just for my daughter. It was for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, silenced, or invisible. It was for anyone who had been treated unfairly because of who they were or what they could not do. The journey ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. I wasn't going to rest until something was done about what had happened. I wasn't going to allow this injustice to go unchallenged, not for my daughter and not for anyone else who might be harmed in the future. The road to justice would be long, and it would require persistence, courage, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But it was a road I was prepared to walk, no matter the cost. What had begun as a single moment of cruelty had now sparked something much larger, a movement for accountability, respect, and dignity in our community. And as long as I had the strength, I would continue to fight for it. Subscribe to the HOA stories and stay informed. Together, we can make a difference.